The year was 1776, and the world was in chaos. 13 colonies, stretched along the eastern coast of North America, had declared something no colony in history had dared to declare before: independence. They had stood against the most powerful empire on earth, the British Crown. But soon after that bold declaration, reality set in. The British Army was not just powerful, it was overwhelming. Trained regiments, endless supplies, and a mighty navy crashed down on the colonies like a storm. George Washington, the man entrusted to lead the ragtag Continental Army, had tasted defeat again and again. His men were hungry, poorly clothed, and losing hope. In the summer of that year, the British seized New York City, turning it into a fortress. Redcoats patrolled the streets, loyalists filled the taverns, and spies for the crown watched every movement of suspected rebels. For Washington, this was devastating. New York was not only a key military prize, it was the beating heart of commerce, intelligence, and communication. Losing it meant fighting blind. And so Washington made a decision that would change history. If he couldn't beat the British in open battle, he would outsmart them in the shadows. The birth of shadows. Washington turned to one of his most trusted officers, a young man named Benjamin Talmadge. Talmadge was intelligent, discreet, and loyal to the cause. More importantly, he had connections, friends, and family back in Setauket, a small town on Long Island now under British occupation. Talmadge was given a dangerous task: build a spy network that could move in and out of New York, gathering intelligence, tracking troop movements, and uncovering British plots before they struck. Talmadge understood the risks. Spying in the 18th century was not a game, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. If captured, there would be no mercy. Spies were hanged as traitors, their families shamed, their names erased. Yet even with such dangers, a group of ordinary citizens stepped forward. Abraham Woodhull, a farmer; Anna Strong, a determined woman with courage far beyond her time; Robert Townsend, a merchant with access to British officers and inner circles; and a handful of others, each one blending into the background of everyday colonial life while carrying secrets that could change the outcome of the war. Thus, the Culper Spy Ring was born. They didn't carry muskets, they didn't march into battle, but they would fight with ink, with whispers, with courage in silence. And through them, the revolution would find hope. A quiet farmer with a dangerous secret. Abraham Woodhull did not look like a spy. He was a farmer, a man who rose with the sun and returned home when the stars appeared. His neighbors knew him as cautious, even timid, a man who preferred the stillness of his fields to the chaos of politics. Yet behind his quiet eyes was a secret burning. The British patrolled his town. He saw their arrogance, their uniforms marching through streets that once belonged to his neighbors. He heard the whispers of loyalists who mocked the rebellion, who claimed America's dream of freedom would die in the dirt. One night, Talmadge approached Woodhull in secret. He laid out the plan, the risks, the cost. Woodhull hesitated. He thought of his family. He thought of the gallows. But he also thought of the future, of a land where his children might live without bowing to a king an ocean away. At last, he agreed. From that moment forward, the farmer was no longer just Abraham Woodhull. He became Samuel Culper, his code name, a shadow in the night whose words would carry the weight of a nation's survival, the woman who hung secrets on a clothesline. In a time when women were expected to stay silent, Anna Strong refused to be invisible. She lived on Long Island, where British soldiers swaggered through villages and loyalists spied on their neighbors. To most, she was simply the wife of Silas Strong, a respected man who had already been arrested for his patriot leanings. But Anna was more than just a wife and mother. She was brave, cunning, and willing to outwit the enemy in ways no soldier could. Her home became a meeting point for spies. Her barn sheltered whispered conversations and coded exchanges. And most brilliantly, she invented a method so simple, so ordinary, that no British officer ever suspected it. On her clothesline, she hung a black petticoat whenever a message was ready to be passed. Alongside it, she placed handkerchiefs. The number and placement of those handkerchiefs revealed the exact location where the secret was hidden. To the enemy, it was nothing more than laundry drying in the wind. But to the Culper Ring, it was a lifeline. Anna Strong became a ghost in plain sight, her courage stitched into the fabric of freedom, ink that could not be seen. Secrecy was the breath of the Culper Ring. They knew that one mistake, one intercepted letter, could unravel everything. So they turned to the tools of invisible war. Talmadge introduced a code book with over 700 entries. Common words became numbers. Names were erased and replaced by digits. Even George Washington himself was hidden, known only as number 711. But numbers were not enough. The spies carried messages written in invisible ink, words that appeared blank until warmed by a candle or brushed with chemicals. British officers handled these letters without suspicion, unaware that the fate of entire campaigns lay hidden between the lines. Messages traveled by horseback, by ship, tucked into barrels, or stitched into clothing. Every journey was a gamble, every courier a heartbeat away from death. Yet time after time, the words arrived. Washington could read the enemy's secrets as if he had sat in their councils himself. It was intelligence, not gunfire, that began to tip the scales. The City of Shadows. New York City under British occupation was a place of tension, of whispers, of constant fear. The streets bustled with merchants, soldiers, and spies, each watching the other. Taverns overflowed with laughter, but behind the mugs of ale, ears strained for valuable scraps of conversation. It was here that Robert Townsend made his stand. Townsend was no soldier. He was a merchant, a man who could slip unnoticed among officers and loyalist elites. His charm was his weapon, his ability to listen without drawing suspicion his greatest strength. By day, he sold goods. By night, he became the Culper Ring's eyes and ears within the enemy's heart. He learned of ship movements, supply shortages, troop strategies whispered over dinner tables. He heard the arrogance of officers who never dreamed a man pouring their wine was feeding their words directly to Washington. Townsend became the silent pulse of the spy ring, a man who lived in constant danger, knowing that a single slip of the tongue would mean the noose. Price of secrets. Every message came at a cost. The British were not blind. They knew rebels lurked in their midst. Patrols doubled. Suspicion grew. Neighbors betrayed neighbors for coin or favor. More than once, letters were seized, and the shadow of discovery crept dangerously close. Woodhull, Townsend, Strong. All of them lived with the constant weight of death pressing on their shoulders. Sleep was restless, meals uneasy, every knock at the door a thunderclap of fear. Yet they endured. They endured because the revolution depended on them. Each time Washington opened one of their coded letters, he saw not just words but sacrifice. He saw the courage of ordinary people who had chosen to become extraordinary. And as the British marched, as loyalists schemed, the Culper Ring continued to weave their invisible web across New York, a net that caught secrets like fish and delivered them to the hungry hands of freedom. Whispers in the tavern. The taverns of New York were more than places for ale and laughter. They were theaters of secrets. British officers boasted after too many drinks. Loyalists whispered about rebel movements. And into this noise slipped Robert Townsend, quiet as smoke. He sat at wooden tables, a merchant among soldiers, his ear tuned to every careless word. To the officers, Townsend was harmless, a man who knew his trade, who provided goods without question. Yet as mugs clinked and candles burned low, he memorized their boasts. He learned which regiment would march tomorrow, which fleet prepared to sail, which general had grown impatient with Washington's stubborn resistance. He carried these fragments in silence, his face calm even as his heart thundered. Then, by night's cover, the words he had gathered became ink and code, messages bound for Washington. Townsend was a shadow in plain sight, feeding the revolution from within the enemy's own halls. Every night he risked everything, for one slip of his tongue or one suspicious glance could end his life on the gallows. The betrayal of neighbors. Setauket, the quiet Long Island village where the Culper Ring began, became a place of dread. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. A friendly nod could hide a loyalist's intent. A handshake might conceal betrayal. British officers walked the lanes, their eyes sharp, their ears pricked for treachery. Those who resisted the crown were jailed, their property seized, their names blackened. Abraham Woodhull felt the weight of it more than most. His farm, his family, his very life stood exposed. More than once, suspicion fell upon him. British soldiers stormed through his door, demanding answers, rifling through his things. Each time, he played the part of the timid farmer, careful never to let the fire in his heart show on his face. But inside, the terror burned. One wrong move, one intercepted message, and he would hang before his own neighbors as an example. Yet Woodhull pressed on. Fear was his constant companion, but so was duty. He told himself that freedom was worth the risk, even if the price was his own life. Washington's secret weapon. Far from New York, George Washington studied the coded letters that arrived from his spies. He knew the worth of every word. To the world, he was a general commanding an army of ragged men. To his enemies, he was a stubborn obstacle in their path. But in truth, Washington was something else entirely, an intelligence officer. Unlike the British, who often scorned the work of spies as dishonorable, Washington embraced it. He believed knowledge was power, more powerful than the largest cannon or the sharpest sword. Each time he read a Culper message, he could see the battlefield more clearly. He knew when to retreat, when to strike, when to wait. The information saved lives, preserved armies, and turned disasters into survival. Washington guarded the ring's secrets fiercely. He knew their names must remain hidden, even from many of his own officers. For if the British discovered who fed him these secrets, it would not only mean their deaths, but the death of the revolution itself. The dance of deception. Spying was never a straight path. It was a dance of deception, of false leads and feigned loyalties. The British had their own spies, men and women who slipped into patriot camps, carrying lies disguised as truth. The Culper Ring had to navigate this dangerous maze, never sure if the man they met was truly an ally or a traitor. One of their couriers, Austin Rowe, rode countless miles through the night, carrying messages hidden in saddlebags, his face set against the wind. Each ride was a gamble. He passed through checkpoints, past watchful eyes, knowing one search could expose everything. Yet he rode again and again, the lifeline between Townsend in New York and Talmadge and Washington beyond. The British, too, sought to ensnare the spies with traps, to spread rumors that might lure them into the open. But the ring moved carefully, cautiously, trusting only the coded numbers, the invisible ink, the signals on Anna Strong's clothesline. They became ghosts that the enemy could never quite catch. a world of shadows and fear. Life in occupied New York was a performance of masks. Loyalists filled the streets, eager to profit from Britain's rule. Patriots hid in silence, their words dangerous, their glances potentially fatal. And in the midst of it, Townsend moved as though he belonged to both worlds and neither. He listened to officers mock Washington as a farmer unfit for command, and he listened silently as they plotted to break the rebellion once and for all. Every evening he walked home with these secrets, the weight of them pressing harder than the night air. He knew that if his cover cracked, if a single soldier questioned his loyalty too deeply, his name would be blackened, and his life would end with a rope around his neck. Yet he carried on, his courage quiet but unbreakable. Outside the city, Woodhull battled his own fears. His family questioned his long absences. British patrols grew more suspicious of his movements. And still, he returned again and again, for he knew that the silence of inaction would be more dangerous than the risks of spying. The turning of the tide. By 1779, the Culper Ring's work began to bear fruit. Their letters revealed British troop numbers, plans of attack, and even whispers of discontent among officers. Washington used this intelligence like a blade, cutting where the enemy least expected, retreating before they could strike, always one step ahead. One of the most critical reports came when the spies discovered Britain's plan to ambush the French fleet as it sailed to aid the Americans. This fleet was not just ships, it was hope itself, the promise that the colonies were not alone in their struggle. Had the British succeeded, the alliance might have crumbled, and with it, America's last chance at freedom. But thanks to the Culper Ring, Washington knew. He moved his men in time, and the ambush failed. The French remained allies. The revolution breathed again. And the Culper Ring, though still invisible to history, had quietly shifted the balance of power in a war that seemed unwinnable. The traitor's shadow. Among the American generals, one name once rang with honor: Benedict Arnold. He had fought bravely in earlier battles, earning respect for his courage and cunning. But by 1780, bitterness had taken root in his heart. He felt overlooked, unappreciated, denied the glory he deserved. And in that bitterness, the British found their opportunity. Secretly, Arnold opened negotiations with the enemy. For money, for recognition, for the pride he believed was denied to him, he was willing to betray his country. His plan was nothing small. He would hand over West Point, the fortress that guarded the Hudson River. If West Point fell, the British would cut the colonies in half, choking the revolution to death. The betrayal was set in motion. But what Arnold did not know was that the shadows were watching. The Culper Ring, listening in taverns, reading coded whispers, began to sense that something was wrong. The information was fragmentary, dangerous to piece together, but it was enough to raise Washington's suspicions. The capture of a messenger. One September night in 1780, fate itself seemed to intervene. Major John Andre, the British officer who carried Arnold's treasonous plans, was stopped on the road near Tarrytown. He was disguised, his papers hidden in his boot. When searched, the secrets spilled out. The betrayal was laid bare. Andre was taken prisoner, his charm and pleas unable to save him from the gallows. But it was not only Andre who stood condemned. The truth of Arnold's treachery soon reached Washington. Rage, disbelief, and sorrow filled the general. One of his most trusted men had sought to destroy everything they had fought for. Arnold, warned at the last moment, escaped into British lines. He lived, branded forever as the traitor whose name would echo with infamy. But thanks to the capture of Andre, and thanks to the intelligence that stirred suspicion, West Point remained in American hands. The revolution endured another day. The weight of silence. The Culper Ring never claimed the credit. They could not. Their survival depended on their invisibility. While newspapers across the colonies shouted of Arnold's betrayal and André's execution, the spies who had helped uncover it sat in silence. Townsend walked through New York as though nothing had changed, though inside he trembled at how close disaster had come. Woodhull returned to his fields, his hands rough with labor, his heart heavy with secrets he could never confess. They lived in a world where victory brought no applause, where survival was the only reward. Their families often suspected nothing. Their neighbors remained in the dark. And yet, each spy carried within them the knowledge that their hidden work had saved the revolution from collapse. It was a heavy burden, one borne without recognition, without thanks. But still they carried it, a narrow escape. Danger did not fade with Arnold's betrayal. If anything, the British grew more suspicious, more ruthless. Patrols tightened. Spies were hunted with greater zeal. Every rider on the road, every merchant in the market, every neighbor in Setauket could be questioned, could be arrested, could vanish. One night, Townsend himself came within a breath of exposure. A careless word overheard, a suspicious glance too long, and suddenly he found himself shadowed through the streets of New York. His heart pounded as he turned corner after corner, his mind racing with the consequences of capture. But fortune favored him. He slipped into a crowded tavern, vanishing among the soldiers whose secrets he had so often stolen. By the time he left, his pursuers were gone. It was a reminder, sharp, terrifying, that every step was the edge of a knife. One slip and death waited. Washington's invisible army. Washington came to rely more and more on the Culper Ring. He called them his invisible army, his shield against blindness. From their letters, he learned of enemy supply shortages, of troop weaknesses, of movements that could be exploited. With their aid, he struck when the British least expected and retreated before they could trap him. What the British saw as luck was in truth the labor of shadows. Washington guarded their identities so fiercely that even Congress knew little of them. He wrote to them with care, always mindful that discovery would mean their deaths. In his eyes, they were as vital as any regiment, as noble as any soldier. Without them, he might have marched into disaster. With them, he could see the winter of hunger. Yet even with the spies' help, the war dragged on in misery. The winter of 1780 was cruel, bitterly cold, and Washington's men starved in their camps. Supplies were scarce, morale thin. In such bleakness, rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers that the rebellion was doomed. Murmurs that perhaps independence was a dream too fragile to hold. The Culper Ring heard these whispers too. In taverns, in markets, they caught loyalists gloating that the rebels would soon beg for mercy. They caught British officers confident that starvation would do their work for them. And though these words chilled the spirit, they also fueled resolve. For Townsend, for Woodhull, for Strong, the thought of surrender was unbearable. If the army froze, if soldiers starved, then it fell to the spies to keep hope alive. Their work became a defiance against despair itself. A world still watching. Beyond the colonies, Europe watched with sharp eyes. Britain's enemies, especially France and Spain, weighed their choices carefully. Would America stand? Or would the rebellion collapse under the might of the crown? The answer often lay not in the clash of armies, but in the whispers carried by spies. The Culper Ring's success in protecting the French alliance echoed far beyond New York streets. Their invisible hands had preserved the only lifeline the revolution could not afford to lose. And though the world did not know it, in small farmhouses, in city taverns, in coded letters carried across rivers and forests, the fate of nations was being written by men and women who asked for nothing but freedom in return. They remained nameless. They remained shadows. Yet their shadows stretched across oceans. The storm over New York. By 1781, New York remained the beating heart of British occupation. Redcoats paraded in the streets, their bayonets glinting under the sun. Loyalist merchants sold their wares with pride, confident that Britain's grip was unshakable. Yet beneath this glittering facade of order, the city was a nest of shadows. Spies whispered in taverns, couriers rode under the cover of darkness, and the Culper Ring wove its web tighter than ever. For Townsend, the city became both a cage and a stage. Every conversation was an opportunity, every careless boast from an officer a weapon to be carried to Washington. Yet every glance, every moment of suspicion, could mean his end. He lived on the edge of exposure, each day another roll of fate's dice. And still he endured, because to abandon his post would mean to blind the revolution in its most desperate hour. The letter that almost ended it all. One autumn evening, a message meant for Washington fell into the wrong hands. A courier, weary from miles on horseback, was stopped by a patrol. His saddlebags were searched, and though the letter was coded, suspicion bloomed. The courier was questioned, threatened, nearly broken. But fortune once more intervened. The soldiers dismissed the letter as nonsense, failing to see the hidden words. When word of the incident reached Woodhull, his blood ran cold. He knew how close they had come to disaster. A single slip of luck, and the ring would have been shattered, its members dragged in chains to face the noose. That night, alone in his farmhouse, he asked himself if the risk was still worth it. Yet by dawn, his resolve had returned. Freedom demanded sacrifice, and if his fate was the gallows, then so be it. Washington's gamble. Washington knew the endgame was near. The war had dragged on for years, bleeding the colonies of men and money. Yet the British were weary too, stretched thin across the globe, their empire strained. If one decisive blow could be struck, perhaps the dream of independence could at last be real. He looked to Yorktown. There, the British Army under General Cornwallis entrenched itself, confident in its strength. But Washington had something Cornwallis did not: the Culper Ring. Through their reports, Washington learned of British weaknesses, of movements that left them vulnerable, of supply lines that could be cut. With French aid secured, thanks again in part to the ring's earlier work, Washington prepared his gamble. A strike at Yorktown could end the war, but only if the enemy remained blind to his true intent, the mask of deception. To fool the British, Washington played his greatest game of deception. He spread false rumors, allowed misleading letters to fall into enemy hands, staged movements that made it appear he planned to attack New York instead of Virginia. The British swallowed the bait. They kept their forces entrenched in the city, certain that Washington's gaze remained fixed there. All the while, his army marched south. The Culper Ring, feeding him tidbits of enemy confidence, confirmed that the ruse held. The British laughed in their taverns, mocking the rebels for their supposed weakness. Townsend listened silently, his heart pounding with the knowledge that those laughs would soon be silenced by cannon fire far away. The dance of deception was nearly complete. Yorktown. In October of 1781, thunder rolled across the fields of Virginia. Washington's army, joined by French allies, surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. The trap had sprung. Cannon roared, earth shook, and the proud British army found itself pinned with no escape. Days dragged into nights of bombardment, the air thick with smoke and despair. Finally, Cornwallis yielded. His troops marched out, their drums beating a slow dirge, their flags furled in surrender. The war was not yet officially over, but the heart of British resistance had been broken. For Washington, it was the victory he had dreamed of. For the Culper Ring, it was proof that their silent war had been worth every risk. Shadows fade. When the cannons fell silent and peace crept back across the land, the Culper Ring dissolved into the quiet of ordinary life. Woodhull returned to his farm. Townsend retreated into anonymity, his secrets locked forever in silence. Anna Strong lived as a wife and mother once more, her clothesline no longer a signal of war. None of them sought glory. None demanded recognition. They slipped back into the fabric of America, unseen, unthanked, but never forgotten in the heart of Washington. In his private papers, he preserved their memory, their names, their courage. He knew that the revolution had not been won by muskets and cannons alone, but by whispers in the dark, by ink that could not be seen, by courage hidden in silence. The world would one day call them heroes, but in their own time, they were simply shadows who dared to dream of freedom. The price of silence. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the war was over. Independence was no longer a dream, it was a reality. The colonies had become the United States of America. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and history was written in bold strokes of triumph. But for the Culper Spies, there was no parade. There were no medals, no speeches, no recognition. Their names remained hidden, their deeds buried in secrecy. Abraham Woodhull returned to his fields, plowing the same soil as though he had never risked his life 100 times over. Robert Townsend slipped back into his trade, carrying the weight of secrets he would never share. Anna Strong lived quietly, her clothesline just laundry once more. They paid the price of silence. While generals became legends and battles were etched into memory, their invisible war remained untold. And perhaps in their hearts that was the way it had to be. Washington's memory. George Washington never forgot them. In his private correspondence, he kept their letters, their codes, their names. He wrote of their courage with respect, knowing that without them, his army might have marched into disaster, his nation unborn. To Washington, they were as noble as any soldier who carried a musket, as vital as any cannon on the field. They had given him vision in darkness, clarity in confusion, and hope when defeat seemed certain. They were his invisible guardians. Yet even Washington could not tell their story to the world. To reveal their names while they lived would have endangered them. So he carried the secret, trusting that history would one day uncover the truth. Rediscovery of shadows. For more than a century, their tale lay hidden in dusty archives. Generations passed, and the Culper Ring faded into whispers, half forgotten, nearly lost. Farmers, merchants, mothers, neighbors, their names were no longer linked to the revolution they had helped win. Then, in the 20th century, historians opened Washington's private files. They found the coded letters, the invisible ink, the records of a spy ring that had never lost a member to capture. Piece by piece, the puzzle was restored. At last, the names of Abraham Woodhull, Robert Townsend, Anna Strong, Benjamin Talmadge, Austin Rowe, and others returned to the light. Their bravery was no longer hidden. Their silence gave way to recognition, and the world discovered that America's independence had not only been won on battlefields, but in the shadows of ordinary lives turned extraordinary. The legacy of courage. Today, we remember the Culper Ring not just as spies, but as symbols of what freedom demands. They remind us that history is not shaped only by the powerful, but by the quiet, by the unseen, by those who risk without reward. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. The revolution was won because ordinary men and women chose to become something greater. They did not carry fame into their graves, but they carried something far more enduring: the legacy of liberty. Their story whispers to us still. In every struggle for freedom, in every defense of truth, in every choice to stand against the odds, we hear the echo of the Culper Spies. Farmers, merchants, mothers, neighbors, ordinary people who dared to dream of an extraordinary nation. And so, the shadows of the past live on, not in silence, but in the freedom we breathe.